To introduce myself, I'm a faculty member here at Oregon State, and you probably noticed by the name and the accent, I grew up in Germany, got a degree in Germany, and then came over to the US. And I'm a silviculturist, and I've been working with various aspects of diverse structured forests, so to speak. Maybe I'll keep it at that. So I'll provide a little background and really set the stage for Mindy in terms of what happens in Oregon and Oregon's forest. So starting with this map here, you see you see on the Pacific Ocean. So what you see is right at the coast here, it's the rainforest, a lot of the light green forest,
Apparently, this signal wasn't good. I think Dr. Klaus got frozen and probably is going to be kicked out of the meeting now. So in the meantime, let's just wait a second and see what happens.
Can people hear me?
Now we can. Now you are mute, Klaus.
All right. I think I'm back. I shut down the VPN and everything else. So that's probably as good as I can make it.
Let's try now.
Okay, so you have the Cascade Mountains. They go up to over 3,000 meters, some of the volcanic peaks. And then on the east side, it gets really dry. The rain shadow effect really kicks in. And most of the white here is actually some type of range and desert.
I think we don't see the screen now.
Oh, okay. Whoop, let's see whether I can do that again.
There we go.
All right. So the white on the east side is desert rangelands, and the higher elevation, you got a few mountains in it. So you got this high productivity land on the west side, Douglas fir, where most of the forestry action is, and then the dry side with some pine forests and high elevation on the east side. And oops, let's see what I can. And you look at the ownership, the main thing that sticks out, we have 60% of federal ownership here, 35% private, and about half of that, I think 56%, is large industrial private, so big companies, real estate investment trust, and timber management organizations. So very production economic driven outfits, I guess, for those people that are not familiar with the real estate investment trust story. And the other half is private woodland, and they manage it, I guess, all over the place. Only 3% belongs to the state of Oregon on that. And then we have very little tribal land, and then other public on that. And I should point out that the higher productivity land is more often than not private. The federal agencies, the Forest Service, mostly got what was left over, what wasn't settled about 100 some years ago. So the lower productivity lands. BLM is a little bit of an exception there. So in terms of the history, the Douglas fir is a tree that can grow up to over 1,000 years on that. Actually, we even have some redwoods bumping into the state, but the history really is driven by when people came in and settled, starting really in the 1920s and then in the 40s, cutting the big old growth forests on that. And the picture below here shows actually when they were done cutting, this is 1912, up in Wind River, actually on Washington land, I should say, just across the Columbia River. But I want to highlight that the clear cuts back then weren't really that clean and clear. And so there's quite a few cedar trees left. And in many places, actually, the cedar trees were sufficient that they regenerated Douglas fir quite nicely on those sites. And then actually big in the 1940s when they got more commercial clear cuts and the industry started to take off as the war effort, et cetera, needed more wood. They came with this idea of checkerboard patterns on that meaning spacing the clear cuts in something like, well, a checkerboard spatial pattern with the idea of the cuts by having always uncut forest in between. And that worked quite well, at least that was segmentation, the value of interior forest habitat conditions in this setting. And then things started to change on that. So when you see here the harvest levels, this the federal one on top and private one down here, they were humming right along in the 80s. At this stage, private land was running out of old growth, and the federal land ramped up their harvest to make up for that. And then we had a big controversy here. And I put this sign of a T-shirt in it. It was really a political controversy on that. And the spotted owl got listed as an endangered species, and that means that harvesting in areas where there was spotted owl habitat became problematic and became outlawed in many places. And so the result of that, what you can see is certainly on federal land, the harvest dropped tremendously to about, well, 10 to 15, 20% of the pre-spotted owl levels. Industry, you don't see that much of a blip, partially because they had cut all that land where the spotted owl was in already, so there was very little change for that. And Mindy will expand on that a little bit as well. So what we have now is, when you think at forestry, you can break it down into these three different groups: a social part of forestry, ecological part, and economic. And the different ownerships fall into different regions of this graph. So the federal one really are heavily addressing ecological areas, issues, as well as social issues, and are not very driven by economic incentives on that. Is protected on that, and this is a picture of the young for that development on that. So quite a bit of protected land, but it is 70, 80 centimeters. Likely will not be cut, at least it takes some good reason to cut that. So it's really a reserve-based management. And then the harvesting activities, the management activities now are really focused on going into those stands that were clear-cut in the starting 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s, and thinning those. As you can see here, this is a thinning operation, variable density thinning operation. You have more open patches, more closed patches in here. These are very highly productive forest stands on those sites that were regenerated to a Douglas fir monoculture. And so right now, actually last time I looked, about 95% of the volume that is coming from federal land comes from thinning operations just like this on that. And so there's quite a bit of backlog of land that needs to be thinned. So that's really the main emphasis you see right now on federal land. Large private land owners would be more on the economic aspect in here. I just highlight examples of that. The typical one, at least on the west side with Douglas fir, is managed by clear cutting operation, very, very aggressive reforestation operation, so there's quite a bit of herbicide applications, and 2, sometimes 3. Claudia can probably tell you better. The trees are coming from a breeding program on that, and they planted rather far apart on that, maybe 700-800 trees per hectare at the most, I think, in many places on industry land. And then they are let grow and not thinned at all, excuse me, and it clear cut again at, well, sometimes around anything between 30 and 45 years, I would think, for most industrial lands. But 30 is probably pretty on the lower end, but I've seen stands, I guess, at 30 being cut, but probably more on the 35-year one. So very aggressively, weed control, very wide spacing so they don't have to thin. Again, the last numbers I saw on private land, about 4% of the volume is coming from thinning operation. So very few landowners do that. Most landowners do not bother. By the time they get dense enough to thin, they basically clear cut and then start over again. As a third option, I want to just highlight the state lands on that. They sit somewhere in the middle. They have to make some money to support the school funds and the counties. But they also have a lot of pressure to deal with ecological and social issues. And they have actually developed an interesting approach, well, what, 20 years ago now, what they call structure-based management. And so what you see here, rather than having an age class distribution of continuously having young and old forests there, they defined their forests in terms of the structure, so regeneration phase, some stem exclusion, and some multi-structured phase. And they cycle all, their plan was to cycle all their lands through all these stages so that at any time you had habitat in these different stages available on your ownership. So it deals with ecological issues, but not relying on reserves like the federal land, but relying on active management and integrating the conservation issues into the management on that. Very intriguing approach, except, and actually from a scientific point of view, very exciting. I certainly did quite a bit of research in that, but their politics have changed, and right now they're abandoning that. Mindy will, I think, hit on that as well, and they're looking for an alternative. So, but when you look at the big landowners, what you see in Oregon is really a bipolar type forestry, at least on the west side here. You know, this is a picture just west of Corvallis here, about half an hour drive. And this is shows 2 ownerships. There's federal ownership, it's a Utah National Forest, and then private ownership mixed in it. And it doesn't take an expert to decide who's who. So you see the very aggressive harvesting operation on the private land on that. You don't see any recent clear cut on federal land, because all they are doing is really thinning those old plantations that they established on that. So it's quite a contrasting way how we manage the landscape in Western Oregon. I want to just of course, there's more to Oregon than the Western Oregon. There's Eastern Oregon. If you look here on the map, the whole Eastern Oregon is kind of as frequent ponderosa pine forest on that.
It happened again. Just a few seconds.
Does anyone have any questions so far that we can address? You can unmute yourself or send it in the chat if you like.
Yes, I do. So far, this kind of triad system that he was presenting, is that very similar to other states in the U.S.? Does Oregon has like a unique kind of forestry system in that way that he was presenting social, ecologic, and economic impacts, or is it very similar across the country?
As far as I know, I'm an undergrad. Claudia might be able to answer this better. As far as I know, this is unique to Oregon. Other states might have a similar method, but I'm pretty sure it's unique to us here.
Yeah, well, we have Dr. Puettmann back.
Yeah.
So
sorry about that. I don't know whether this is me or not. So let me just finish this pointing out in southwestern Oregon, we have an intermediate fire regime. And then in all these wet forests here on the west side, northwest side, we have very low frequencies of fires every 100 to 500 years. Of course, when it burns pretty hot because they've accumulated a lot of fuel, at least naturally they have. And the only real disease for the Douglas fir, one of the reasons that it's such an interesting tree to manage, is what you see here, Swiss needlecast on that, which is, slowing down, not killing, but slowing down growth of Douglas fir right along the coast, maybe the first 25K inland from the coast. But on the east side, which I had neglected, I think the fires are very prominent, so all management need for it. And you can see some pictures here. And that's been quite effective, especially with collaboratives. Maybe I'll stop it right there as I get signals that my internet connection is stable. Mindy is, I think, next taking it from here. I will unshare my screen. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Puettmann. That was really good. Very informative.
Well, sorry about the connection, but
that's okay. We've all been there.
Okay, Claudia, you want me to just forge ahead?
yes, please.
Okay. Hi all, it's great to see so much interest in this little chat about Oregon forestry from all across the world. It's really exciting, and of course, all of our new reality brings with it lots of technical challenges. So hopefully it's not a Corvallis internet issue, but I'll just do my best to go ahead and share my screen and maybe cover another side of forests in Oregon. So one moment. All right, is that all visible? Great. I put my email address there at the bottom. As you can see, it's just my name, mindy.crandall@oregonstate.edu. So if anybody wants to follow up, please feel free to do so. I'm an assistant professor of forest policy at Oregon State University. I actually am from the Oregon Coast Range originally, so in kind of an unusual path, have been away for a while at various places, but have recently come back to Oregon State, and I'm very excited to be working back in my home environment, if you will. So this map just sort of sets the stage for those of you who aren't as familiar with the United States' land tenure system, but what this map shows is for each state, the proportion of the land that's in federal ownership. And there's a stark east-west divide. So public lands, federal ownership dominates a lot of the conversation about resource use in the western part of the country, and not so in the eastern part where private land is predominant. So Oregon's not alone, not unique in its predominance of federal lands. But for a lot of the other Western states, a lot of that federal ownership is in rangeland rather than in forest land. And so as Klaus noted, fully 60% of our forest land is in federal ownership, which is kind of unique to the Pacific Northwest states like Washington, Idaho, and to some extent, Northern California. We're always talking about timber harvest levels in Oregon. This is similar to what Klaus just showed us, but it goes back a little bit further in time. We focus on timber harvest levels a lot because Oregon's economy was really built around timber harvest, and it remains a priority for the state, and it's a big part of our culture as well. You can see the black line is the total harvest for the state, which you see that giant dip in the Great Depression, not surprisingly. We don't have a ton of data points outside the Great Depression prior to the 1940s, but you can extrapolate that we were harvesting about 4 billion board feet annually. That really started to ramp up, as Klaus noted, in particular after the end of World War II. And at some point in time, we have the data that we can disaggregate this harvest into private and state, which is the orange line, the U.S. Forest Service, which is the green line, and then starting in the 60s, the blue line is the Bureau of Land Management, which is the other main federal landowning agency in addition to the U.S. Forest Service. So the driving force initially was private lands. Now, if we take just the total harvest and portion it out between the private and state and the federal, the shares of those two. So this is for whatever harvest level, what proportion is coming off of private lands versus federal lands. You can see two big swings in the Oregon harvest. And this has big implications, as Klaus noted, both for our landscape level outcomes, but also for our communities, our rural economies. So at the beginning, or towards the end of World War II, the bulk of the harvest was on private lands. And as those highly productive old growth forests were being cut over, and as the entire US was experiencing this great economic boom, the pressure for more of that harvest to come from federal lands really started to dominate. And so for about 30 years, from about the 60s to the 90s, this share of the harvest was half and half. Half was coming from federal lands and half was coming from private lands. And following the listing of the northern spotted owl and that plummet in the share of federal harvest, Oregon has returned to about 4 billion board feet of harvest annually, as opposed to the 8 to 9 billion that was the heyday of the Oregon timber industry. And the bulk of that is coming from private lands. So you can see that both of us show a landscape view. That kind of is how we think about forestry in Oregon, because it has such stark visual contrast between the different types of management. So this is a Google Earth shot from further south than the one that Klaus showed you, but it really highlights some of the things at play in Oregon forestry. And so I'm just going to touch on really briefly a few of these. And then if we zoom in, you can really see these at play, right? So the first is what's impacting private lands management. And the dominant thing that's shaping that is the Oregon Forest Practices Act at this point in time. Then we also have the state lands, which aren't in this photo, but we're going to touch a little bit on some of those current topics that are facing state lands. And then finally, the federal lands, where the two biggest impacts are coming from the National Forest Management Act, or what we call NIFMA, and then the Northwest Forest Plan, which was what was the development after the listing of the northern spotted owl. And I don't think I'm going to have time to go into the ONC lands, but that's what's making these blocks, these square blocks of alternating sections that you can see here. It's a fascinating little subtext of Oregon forestry. So for starters, the Oregon Forest Practices Act, the roots of that actually lie back in the 1940s. The first act was the 1941 Oregon Forest Conservation Act that required reforestation after logging. So reforestation has always been a big issue in Oregon. The Forest Practices Act was passed in 1971. It was the first comprehensive Forest Practices Act in the United States. And it has remained fairly strong, although our neighbors to the north and south, Washington and California, their Forest Practices Acts are arguably more stringent than ours is at this point in time. But it's in sharp contrast to most of the southern US, which does not have state level Forest Practices Acts in place. the biggest emphasis really is on riparian areas and reforestation. A lot of the laws and regulations within the OFPA vary by different regions within the state, because as Klaus pointed out, we have extremely different conditions from the Coast Range to the eastern side of the state. And so the expectations for reforestation and for riparian outcomes are different. The OFPA was passed with broad support from the timber industry. Actually, they looked around and they saw some federal legislation coming down the pike in the form that became the Clean Water Act in 1972, and they really wanted to head that off. And they were also concerned about some bad actors in the system who were not practicing good forest management. And so in the beginning, it was really supported by the timber industry. And so if we look back at our landscape view, we can see some of the major outcomes from the Oregon Forest Practices Act. So the first is these patch sizes, which Klaus touched on. Clear cuts are regulated to a maximum size in Oregon, so you can see that in this patchiness. There's also requirements about adjacency of clear cuts, and so you can see that the cleared areas are not directly next to each other. We have to allow for green up in between. So the type of harvest dictates the reforestation requirements and what you have to leave behind for wildlife, but you can clearly see our riparian areas restrictions in these lines of trees that basically mark out where there's a stream, and those trees have been left to protect the riparian area values. So the Forest Practices Act changes both through the Board of Forestry, so procedural changes, and also through legislative action. So sometimes changes come from the legislature itself. It's a living, breathing act. It's been changed, I don't know, more than 30 times since 1971. It's constantly being updated. And most recently, there were changes to the riparian area buffer widths around certain types of fish-bearing streams. We haven't talked a lot about uneven age management. There's nothing in the OFPA that precludes uneven age management in this area, but the combination of economics and ecology really drives those private forest landowners to practice very intensive, even-aged silviculture on these lands. But Klaus knows way more about that than I do. So state lands. State lands occupy a really unique space. They have occupied a really unique space in the state of Oregon in that sort of middle ground, producing something other than that bimodal distribution of constantly churning 40-year rotations versus very little harvest and increasingly older forests on federal lands. And they did have that really unique structural target management. And so what happened, unfortunately, is that the state lands were sued. The state was sued by the counties. So county is basically the next unit of governance below the state in the United States, especially in the western part of the United States. And the state forest lands, those lands originated with basically tax foreclosures that were forfeited back to the counties. The counties didn't have the ability to manage those lands, and so they agreed to pass them back to the state in exchange for roughly two-thirds of the receipts from the management of those lands. And in the 90s, when the Oregon Department of Forestry began managing those lands for multiple values, including recreation and watershed values and things like that, that meant that they were harvesting less timber. And so recently, a group of counties got together and they sued the state, arguing that the state, in fact, had not lived up to its contract. Its contract was to manage for the greatest permanent value. And by changing the way they defined value to include more than timber harvest, thus lowering the economic benefit to the counties, they argued that was a violation of that contract. And the judge ruled in favor of the counties, so now the state is required to pay back $1 billion to the various counties and municipalities underneath them where there has been less harvest since the mid-90s. Coming back to federal lands, federal lands have, well, maybe you haven't heard a lot about them. We heard a lot about them living here in Oregon. You always hear about them because of everything that happened after the listing of the northern spotted owl. And the reason why that was so important was because it created a hard stop in that harvest, in that there was literally a federal injunction or a requirement that they cease harvesting that went into effect while they determined what the status was of the northern spotted owl. But the northern spotted owl and the Endangered Species Act arguably was just the lever that was used. Really, the issue was the protection of the remaining old growth. The private lands had cut over all of their old growth. The only old growth left was on federal lands. And as society sort of started emphasizing more values that they wanted from the forests, the only place left of that was the federal lands. Sorry if you hear some background noise, that's my dog. So what has become really interesting is that that management of federal lands has shifted, but that shift actually began before the Northwest Forest Plan and the Northern Spotted Owl listing. It began in the 70s with the passage of the National Forest Management Act, which really changed the way national forests planned and allocated land. And then that was sort of highlighted with the spotted owl issue. Now, since the 90s, those forest plans have been changed. There's a lot of different land allocations. You can see in this map, it shows a section of federal land in Central Oregon and all the different types of land allocations now at play. Much of the land is reserved. As Klaus said, it's really a reserve-based strategy. Very little of it is open for harvest. And so harvest levels remain very low from federal lands. See if I'm missing anything that I wanted to make sure I highlighted. Okay. So let's just kind of go back to our big picture of these forest land ownerships in Oregon, because this is sort of where the relationship between the forest industry and rural communities, or these small rural places that were formerly oftentimes timber dependent, come into play. So because exactly as Klaus noted, because the distribution of federal lands is not uniform across the landscape. It was really the land that was left over. It's less productive. And so it tends to be concentrated. You can see that in the northwest part of the state, it's a big mix of really large scale industrial private owners and state lands, which again, previous to 1990s were managed very similarly, or more similar to private lands than to the federal lands. And then big blocks of federal lands in some areas, especially across the crest of the Cascades, but also in Eastern Oregon. In Eastern Oregon, almost all of the forest land is federally owned. And so that means that as these different policy shifts have happened, it's had a spatially different impact in different places. So there are some rural places that are embedded in a timber shed that's predominantly federal land. And because timber is bulky and expensive to move it, you can't necessarily maintain that milling infrastructure in those places. Some communities have transitioned really well to this new, more holistic, amenity-driven preservation management on federal lands. They've capitalized on that, but some have not. And so one of the things that the U.S. Forest Service and others like myself, this is a big area of my interest, is looking at the fates of these rural places in areas that were or remain timber dependent and what that looks like. So this is just a map from a U.S. Forest Service publication where they mapped out the socioeconomic status of communities, whether it was low, medium, or high, and whether it had been trending up, down, or staying the same over the decade between 1990 and 2000. So when those first impacts of the reduction in federal timber supply were being felt. And so you can see a lot of places are doing really well. Those tend to be clustered around areas of growth, transportation corridors, urban areas, things like that. But a lot of areas on the fringe of these federal lands have not rebounded as successfully. And so that, since the 1970s, 2/3 of the mills in Oregon have closed. A lot of that is due to other factors. A lot of that's due to consolidation in the industry, increasing efficiency of new mills. And so they force old mills out. The highly specialized nature of old mills that were designed to process old growth versus now are 40-year-old trees, that is the dominant harvest. So some of that is not about the reduction in federal timber supply, but some of it is. And just to remind you of that share of harvest, we had about this 30-year window where the amount of volume was pretty balanced between private and federal, and that has really changed. So that's just kind of an overview of some of the policy factors impacting why our Oregon's landscape looks the way it does, and hopefully there weren't too many technical glitches.
There weren't. Thank you, Mindy. It was a great presentation too. So now let's give a space for questions. Before Daniel Guerra asks a question to Dr. Klaus Puettmann, asking if this triad approach was unique from Oregon or if other states also had this approach.
That's a good question. You know, actually the triad concept is like 20 years old, and in Oregon, it almost happened by coincidence based on the ownerships on that. And so in other states, you know, that don't have much federal ownership, they would be missing on the component in terms of conservation on that. So if you go through and take Mindy's slide there where she showed the different federal ownership, it's really that mix of ownership that would determine how much of the triad approach you see playing out in the various states. And I guess I should mention that's fairly recent, as Mindy hinted. I think 1980, if you would have flown over Oregon, you would not have been able to distinguish federal land much from private land, at least the managed portions. And now, as we both showed, it's totally obvious.
Thank you very much. And if I might add a little bit more, is you think this triad approach as well is a bit more competitive or more efficient or just superior to other maybe states? Because when you think about Oregon, at least from outside of the states, one of the first things that you think of, it's their forest and their strong forestry sector. So do you think that like this kind of triad model has been one of the ground basis for it, or is it more other factors? And if so, which ones do you think it would be?
Oh, that's a very, very good and very, very relevant question. In fact, Oregon State is right now in negotiations to take over 30,000 hectares of forest land as an experimental forest, so we can actually test experimentally in the landscape whether you're better off separating different land uses and having part of the landscape very intensively focused on timber production, part of the land, you know, then as reserves and wilderness areas, or whether you're better off managing the whole landscape in some kind of alternative, softer way that simultaneously provides timber and biodiversity and conservation values on that. That's a big discussion, which way you go, which way you're better off. There's been quite a bit of work done in agriculture, very little in forestry, and I guess if I can take some credit here for OSU, we're trying to be on the cutting edge of that issue by putting experimental sites on the ground to actually test that.
Yeah, if I can just piggyback on that, you know, the triad as a concept is really pretty broad, right? It's the idea of thinking about your landscape and the values it provides really broadly, so that not every acre has to be plantation forestry, but not every acre has to be a wilderness preserve, right? And I've spent the last 5 years in Maine where the land ownership context is very different, and they're still just as keenly interested in the idea of triad as a way to think about landscape level management of forests, that each of those, you know, each of those plantations, reserves, and more ecologically minded forestry have a role to play in providing all of the values that people need from forests, because we need timber, we need paper, we also need biological diversity, we also need wilderness, we need cultural and spiritual values. And so it's more of a framework than anything. But like Klaus said, we're sort of sitting in this natural experiment because of the incentives and the policies that are acting on these different landowners. That's led us to really having a landscape that is reserved or highly managed plantations. And you know, I think it's that loss of the state acting as that actor that was more experimenting with the ecologically minded forestry, the longer rotations filling that middle ground is something that we don't know the implications of, but that's where OSU might be able to play a role in determining what those implications are.
Very interesting answers. Thank you very much.
Great. I have another question for both of you. So what would you change, or would you like to try to change in either forest management or forest policies to make Oregon's forestry better under your own criteria?
Well, this is a personal value system, of course, coming into play. Yes. On that. And one of the things that I see as an issue is the way the policy or the economic picture plays out in Oregon. It really pushes the quick returns and the stuff that we have companies spend a lot of money, thousands of dollars per hectare, reforesting, getting Douglas fir growing. And then they use, I guess in Germany would be Bodenreinheitsertragslehre would be the word. But once you put an interest rate on that and you want to recover, I don't know, 5, 6, 7% interest, the pressure is that you really have to harvest quickly on that. And I think with some different incentives, tax laws and stuff, it'd be fairly, I shouldn't say easy, but it'd be possible to change that. The other thing I think that may not happen, if we get the carbon market to play out and people get paid to store carbon on their forest land, and that would be a payment that, I guess in terms of ecosystem services, for all those factors associated with having big old trees standing in the landscape, that could change the role, and maybe that's an incentive-based system. But if the carbon market plays out, I guess like it's starting to do in California and stuff, that would change the world for us here in Oregon, especially on the intensively managed lands. Mindy?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's funny because when I think both Klaus and I kind of smiled and laughed, but we all have our pie in the sky visions of how we would love the Oregon landscape to look, right? And when I first got my bachelor's degree in forest management, in fact, that was really what inspired me 25 years ago or whatever was, okay, why do we not see old growth on private lands, right? Like why is it only left on federal lands? And that's what sort of drew me into economics, because the fact remains, like Klaus said, that under the modern sort of accounting system, interest-based, discounted cash flow system, the incentive is in the state of Oregon, given the parameters of the Oregon FPA, for private landowners, the incentive is to invest heavily in that reforestation and not in any stand tending. Like Klaus said, there's very little thinning that occurs in these forests, and there's zero incentive to grow long rotations. So there's a mismatch there. So if we want older forests, if we want more of those middle ground values, those middle forest values, we've got to figure out a way to make it economical. We've got to figure out a way for it to pay for private landowners. I feel that we're really lucky that we sort of have the federal lands as like our backstop, because they can operate outside of the economic sphere. They don't have to produce returns to shareholders in the way that TMOs and REITs do. But as long as that system is in play, we've got to have market-based systems. So carbon markets, payments for ecosystem services. None of this is really operational. It's all sort of theoretical, but if we had some way to reimburse landowners for providing those other forest values that we all get from older forests or even middle-aged forests, that's what I would love to see. Now, that's not without its pain too. If you're growing a forest for carbon, you're not milling, you're not, there's a whole other part of the forest economy that is not supported. And we don't have a really good solution for how are we going to transition loggers and mill workers and the other part of the economy that has been dependent on timber harvesting to a forest economy that's based on more values than just timber. So lots of work to be done.
Great. Thanks for your answers. Anybody else wants to make a question?
Yeah. I'd like to ask, beside the Douglas fir, which are the other species you have? Maybe not only from a production point of view, but also like for a more natural species that grow there.
Yeah, you know, in Oregon State, if you come and study here, you can work with any species you want, as long as it's Douglas fir on that. So clearly it's the prominent one, but we actually have, if you go like to Southern Oregon, that intermediate disturbance regime, I remember I went on one district, they had 14 different conifer species on a single district. So there's from Engelmann spruce to knobcone pine to all kind of the true firs, the ABs, various versions of that. There are some of the cedars on that, some of the cyparis, and so the west side is very heavily dominated by conifers on that, and I think part of that is due to the climate is mild enough that in the winter, when we have the rain, it gets warm enough that the conifers can photosynthesize. And the broadleaves obviously lose out on that kind of setting. So in terms of broadleaves, we have the maple and the white oak here on the west side, red alder, prominent and recent disturbances. Once you get to the east side, you have some aspen, and I guess there's some birch in the upper left corner I've seen, but very little in that setting. Actually, from a botanical point of view, most of our forests, if you just go from a general diversity, are not that diverse. I think with the exception of the lower part there, the southwest corner, the Siskiyou Mountains, which if you take ever a community ecology class, you can read the classic paper by Robert Whittaker, who kind of pointed out that actually it's there down there, the diversity is climate and soil driven on that, very contrasting soils, and that makes it very unique. The rest of Oregon is not particularly diverse. When I worked in Minnesota, I had mixed species experiments I put in, up to 10 species that grew native in an area together. I can't do that in Oregon.
Thank you.
And you know, just to add on to that, our economy is definitely focused on Doug fir, but back in the day, you know, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, ponderosa pine on the east side, Pinus ponderosa, was just as important in terms of the harvest economy, especially for some of those towns there on the east side.
Do you see this can be an issue to have just mainly one species everywhere? Also maybe resilience to maybe past in the future, or climate change that may create different conditions?
Yeah, the heavy reliance on Douglas fir is a concern, and certainly some of our work, you know, when I talk to industrial people, but as I mentioned, we don't have big diseases right now, which sort of the Swiss needlecast on the coast, but you can also flip that around and saying we one insect and one disease, especially Phytophthora fungi, away from losing Douglas fir. And then we're going to switch the lights off in Oregon, I'm sure, on that. In terms of climate change, people are a little bit more confident or maybe arrogant, depends on your view. You know, Douglas fir has a very wide distribution. It goes down into Mexico. And so it's, you know, and you find it at whatever, 9,000 feet outside of Tucson, Mount Lemmon. So there has a lot of diversity within the species. And when I talk to geneticists, they count on that diversity carrying it the day in terms of adapting to climate change, that we don't have to switch species per se, but we just take the provenances, the different sources from prior warmer climates on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your answers. And I would like to ask you if you have a few more minutes, if other people have more questions, because it's already 11 a.m.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, other questions?
Mindy, I had a question for you. I saw that you work with communities as well. So I just wanted to ask if there is any community forestry in Oregon, or how is the forest certification there, like the system?
That's a great question, and I know I saw Meredith on here somewhere. I feel like I should defer to her.
Yeah.
But I can take a stab at that. So community forestry, you know, in general, is not a huge player in the United States. You know, we have sort of the way our land tenure system is set up. There are some small NGOs that kind of operate as community-based forestry. I actually knew a lot more examples of that in Maine, where I lived before, than in Oregon. And I'm trying to remember the second part of your question. Sorry, I lost my train.
Oh, okay. The second part was like, how is this forest certification? Is it just?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So forest certification is middlingly popular in the United States as a whole. I would say it's certainly more popular in the states like where Klaus and I both worked before, that are dominated by private land ownership. The federal land in the United States, unlike Canada, is not certified. You know, their management far exceeds any standards that would be required for certification. So and typically it's not certified. So overall, I'm not sure, Klaus might know what the percent of forest land that is, and I'm thinking of certified by the big two, so FSC and SFI, right? I'm not sure what the percent of forest land, private forest land in Oregon is that's certified. In the states where it's a big player like Minnesota and Maine, it's, you know, upwards of 60% or maybe even higher of the private forest land is certified. But a lot of industrial landowners aren't seeing that really pay off as an investment. It is a cost to them. And so, you know, certification, I think as a whole, is an ongoing conversation in the United States.
Okay, thank you.
And there was a question in the chat about the $1 billion repayment. I haven't been following that since the initial decision was made, but there was an attempt at an appeal that was denied. So the state tried to appeal the ruling and that was denied. They did set a very high interest rate on those repayments. So I don't know what the exact schedule looks like in terms of what the repayment schedule is at this point in time, especially now the state is facing a budget crunch given the coronavirus situation. So I don't really know what that's going to look like. And I think it's too soon. This decision was just handed down in November. And so I think it's really too soon to know what the impact is going to be on the future land management or the ownership, other than it does, as Klaus mentioned, we're exploring creating this large experimental forest. That's a former state forest. And in part, the reason why they're trying to get out of owning it is because they cannot pay for the management of that anymore under the current situation. But that has been in the works for quite a while, long before this decision was handed down.
Are there other questions?
Yes, please. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Great. I would like to know if there's any pressure in community NGO legislation level on climate change in the forestry sector, and how is this thing addressed from the specialists?
I was going to defer to you on that one, Klaus.
Actually, at this stage, I do not see a big political movement coming down to influence forestry directly. There are various groups working on it in terms of pushing a carbon market. Here and there, we had actually legislature pending to establish that, and they ended up with a big scandal in the legislature, and I haven't there's been attempted to make it, push it through again, but it's going to be rough, especially in the current days with the virus hitting the state as it did. So short of the carbon market, I don't really see many big initiatives on that, even though there's some pressure, but not at a state level.
Yeah, that's right. So there was a bill, basically like a carbon cap and trade bill that came before the state to become law, and this last year. And what happened was that a portion of the legislators walked out and refused to go to work. So it couldn't be voted on. And they did the same thing this year when it was reintroduced. Even though the bill had been reworked to attempt to address some people's concerns, it still was a politically kind of a non-starter. It's interesting politically in the state of Oregon because we have a Democrat governor and a Democrat dominated legislature. So because they basically have the votes to pass anything, the only way that the Republicans can hold this up is by refusing to go to work so that there's not a quorum. A quorum meaning there's not enough people there to actually allow a vote. So that's kind of the political place that we're in with regards to things like climate change.
May I adapt to that? Another question, what's your idea about climate change? Like, how do you feel about it? Is it something, I wouldn't say, of course it's real, but is it something that is necessarily bad? Do you think it's part of the natural process? Do you think that there should be something really drastic to address it?
Well, actually, first I should point out, when I talk about this issue, I really try to make an effort to talk about global change on that. It's more than just the climate. The big changes, you know, from one day to the next now, when you get a new disease, when you get a new insect coming in the state, there's a lot more going on in terms of, you know, global marketing. I mean, for a while, Douglas wood prices in Oregon were probably more determined by China than by Oregon. And so there's a lot more global things going on. You know, in terms of the impacts of that, you know, I've been trying to work a little bit with adaptive capacity of forest, and I'm preparing them for its future, but that is full of surprises on that. And all I can say is, when you think, you know, we see some issues going on, like probably right now in Central Europe, it's more prevalent in the newspaper when I listen to my brother who complains. We ain't seen nothing yet on that. And so, you know, we really need to rethink how we do forestry. And I kind of sense, you know, once it gets there where it is in Central Europe, the landowners will really rethink why do they own the forest on this setting. And it's really going to be a fundamental change in how people relate to forestry on that. So, you know, we need to obviously think about a social adaptation, economic adaptation, but in terms of ecology, we need to be quite aggressive on that. And it's more than, you know, what they call assisted migration, that has its own set of issues and problems, and picking species. It's the whole idea of, you know, we treated this as a crop in many places, and that's not possible anymore in the future. And actually the big changes I think we'll see in those wilderness areas, you know, those lands that a timber company reforests every 30 years, they can pick new genetic material, new species, or new Douglas fir saws. They can spray if there is some issue maybe with an insect, etc. But those wilderness areas where we don't go in, and where we have trees that are now 300 years old and regenerated during the Little Ice Age, that's where we're going to see the big impact happen in the future.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry, I can't be more positive, but it's a great opportunity to me. Actually, that's what I'm trying to, maybe I should emphasize that more. Things are really changing, and we can either sit back and wait for it to happen and then try to fix what we need to fix, or we can try to get ahead of the curve and look at this as an opportunity, how we change forestry but also actually in a bigger conceptual way, how we educate the public about natural resource management. I mean, not right now in the US, but I know when I travel around the world, a lot of places, climate change and forestry, I mean, I go, when my brother sends me the newspaper articles from Germany, forestry is on the front page on that. That doesn't happen unless you have an emergency like this. So now can we use that to tell people about natural resource management and making better stewards of the earth, rather than complaining that things are happening due to factors outside of our control. So you as students have a great opportunity at hand, and you need to run with this.
That was great, Klaus. I kind of refrain from saying everything because sometimes I'm in a pretty pessimistic mode when it comes to climate change. I think particularly when you look at the politics in the United States, but I do agree this is a chance for wise natural resource management to play a role in a really emerging global issue. And that part is exciting. And so I think that there's a lot of room for things to improve. Let's hope.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you both said. And at this point on the history where we are seeing wildlife viruses or viruses related to wildlife jumping to humans because we are impacting their habitats and directly consuming those species, I think that conservation is a matter of global security, biosecurity, and it's, as you said, a great opportunity to make those changes and hopefully translate all this social awareness into policy. But at the same time, we're going to face a big economic problem. I don't know how to call it, but how do you think it's going to be that balance between like people taking care of the environment, but also needing to survive under the economic system that dominates the world right now?
Well, I think it depends on, of course, where you are. And, part of the world, the economy right now is not relying on forestry, at least extractive forestry, while other parts really are on that. And, we have to find some kind of dynamic balance in the future. And it really depends on where you are. I mean, there are parts of the world that don't even have forest and seem to be, at least for a while, they were doing okay in this type of setting. There will be changes, there is no question about it. And every time there are changes, there'll be winners and there'll be losers in this. And again, I think the ticket will be to try to get ahead of the curve and prepare for that. And think about if we see some changes, like in Oregon, if one would have predicted this, one could have gone back and thought about different educational programs that educate people that live in a forestry, extractive forestry dominated area, and saying, well, in 10 years from now, you will need other jobs. So can we now go into the schools, provide some education, provide some other resources that the people are prepared for it beforehand. So the scary part in the US, at least on a federal level, we're not doing anything like that. We're going the other way. But I guess when you think about your own area, communities where you live on that, it's, we need to anticipate that. And for my personal work, I decided not to focus on improving growth in monoculture plantations, but look at alternative ways to manage the forest that have a more balanced setting. So that's how I personally try to, I guess, make my contribution on that. And when you as students think about where you want to go, yes, you have opportunities for jobs or projects, and you have to be adaptable and flexible, and you have to take advantage of opportunities. But I always tell students, well, is it going in the right direction or not? If there's something that you really can stand behind with your personal values and personal ethics, and again, I guess I've kind of come into this middle ground where we have to juggle various usage and find a forestry that feeds the different ecosystem services and needs.
Thanks for your answer, Klaus. Is there any other question around?
Hear me? Claudio, can you hear me?
Yes, a little.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me now? I'm trying to speak closer to the microphone. Yeah, okay. I wanted to ask a couple of questions if there is time. If it's too long, doesn't matter, just out of curiosity. Connecting to the question about forest certification, at least in Europe, for the forest certification, you need to have more than one species in the forest. And as far as understood from what have been described by both, it's mostly one monospecific forest. So how to deal with that? And also, if you have any problems with browsing, since the ungulates you have are like the double of the size of the ones we have in Europe. So just to know that. And third, if in Oregon any not native species has been tried before, like for example we tried in Europe with the Douglas fir, so a similar situation but there. Thank you.
I can answer 1 and 3. I didn't hear number 2, so maybe I'll try 1 and 3. In terms of certification, I guess there are 2 things. A, big part of private land is certified what they call it the Sustainable Forest Initiative, which is an industry-driven certification program. And so according to in that, they are not putting pressure on land for mixed species on that. So I guess it's fair to say it's a little softer than the Forest Steward FSC certification. And even FSC, I've audited a couple times for FSC. When FSC goes to different places in the world, they're trying to adjust and adapt to local conditions on that. And so in this case, these forests here, many of those were naturally pretty Douglas fir dominant. They're not solely on that. It is not that far on many places from the natural set of conditions, so it does not create the same problem as you would find it in other places on that. In terms of the species on that, as I mentioned, we have one of the more attractive species as local native species, and I think that makes a big difference in terms of the public perception of forestry on that. We have some trials now of other species. I know the people trying to plant redwoods. I found some actually in our college forest. We have some Scotch pine from Europe. There's some landowners tried different species here and there on operational basis. They're not used at all. I guess recently industry tried eucalyptus and some radiator pine as a trial, and I sense that is not going forward in an operational setting. So in terms of forestry, we have a species that's growing really well. On Douglas fir, on our best sites, will grow 25 cubic meters per hectare per year. On that, it's highly valued. The market is there. Very few diseases. So we haven't seen the need or the benefit of moving into other species here. And I don't know what number 2 was. I don't know whether Mindy wants to add something.
Sure. I mean, I think the middle question was about browsing and the pressures on the forest from browsing. I know, some experimental work in Oregon looking at the role of ungulate browsing on plantation regeneration. But I can tell you anecdotally, it's nothing like what the hardwood forests in the northeastern part of the country are facing, where so in places like Pennsylvania and other places like that, they're actually having regeneration failures of some species due to browse. And Klaus probably knows more about that than I do in terms of our conifer plantations here.
Yeah, just yesterday I walked on my own land around 2 hectares around the house and complained about the deer eating all the Douglas fir that I planted in this setting. If you have a few ones, certainly like some of the cedars and the oak seedlings, I had to protect with some extra tubes to get them to grow efficiently. The Douglas fir, actually in an operational setting, most industry have decided that if they have very good weed control, Douglas fir will grow quite aggressive, and even if browse back a year or two, then it puts on a meter leader and grows out of the browsing range. So at least for Douglas fir on our sites and the pines, the standard operation industries decided to put more money into weed control, and then they don't have to protect them for browsing. But you get into the other species like the cedar, the tuya, you get into species like, every so often like oak. I planted some oaks on my property. Without some browsing protection for deer and elk, we have a tough time bringing them up. But we have wolves moving in from the east on that. They are established on the east side, so maybe that will change. At this stage, even though we have actually cougars or puma, even on my own property, I have seen them, the deer population is still way too high. It makes some damage, but not operationally on the bigger ownerships.
All right.
Just a clarification. To understand, so the density of the ungulates is not so high, like perhaps it's in Europe, for example.
No.
Okay.
No, I think if you look at the numbers, I'm not sure we have 40 deer per square kilometer or something like that. It's way lower. The impact is way lower than Europe, that's for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so if there are not any questions, I think we should close this meeting. And I would like to thank Dr. Crandall and Dr. Puettmann for their great lectures and responses to all the questions we had. And I think this was a great opportunity for us to share different points of view and also different backgrounds as we all have from different parts of the world. So once again, thank you very much for your great contribution to this international meeting. We're really happy to have you both here.
Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. It's nice to see interest from all across the world.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for the invitation on that. And my email is the same. Actually, if you spell my name, there are not that many Klaus Puettmanns in the forestry profession. You can Google me. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions or insights or suggestions.
Thank you. You guys want to say anything else? Carmen, Maya, Chris?
Just that we have more activities this week. I don't have the schedule handy. Chris or Maya, do you want to give some information about that?
Yes, tomorrow's our IFSA day, which starts 1 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. That we have the explanation for the procedures for our positions and CARM 2021 host, as well as a guest speaker from Lisa Pryor from Germany. She is going to be there at 9 p.m. her time to give a great insight into the IFSA, UFRO, and EFI task force. So yeah, you're welcome to join into that. We'll post the Zoom link in the comments on Facebook and email them when we do that. So yeah, and yeah, thank you, Klaus and Mindy. That was exceptional.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, so see you all tomorrow at 1. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.